Listen and do not flinch. I will give you a secret that most men are never allowed to hold. This is not a tale of supernatural fright sold for clicks. This is an anatomy of power that eats memory and returns only terror. You are about to descend into the cramped rooms and colder intentions beneath a New Orleans garden where a house was built above a well of bodies and the city pretended not to notice. Here this is training rather than entertainment, because knowledge changes men, and once this enters you it will not leave in the same shape. Picture the city in spring of 1832, a port swollen with trade and ambition, merchants with ledgers the size of small Bibles, fortunes shifting like tides. A Boston man named Thomas Caldwell arrives with a plan to plant his dynasty in the rich soil of commerce. He chooses an old French property in a district of oak and moss and brick walls that keep the street out and something else in. For reasons not recorded, the house has a deep well and a basement with drainage beyond practical need. A feature that made the people of that era whisper and walk on the other side of the street. I will speak plainly and with authority. You must understand the architecture of Erasure to resist it. The Caldwell family appears on society pages as another merchant clan, polite smiles and tea, yet behind those smiles a quiet disintegration begins within 6 weeks. A child hears scratching none else can hear. A daughter kneels by the sealed well and hears a voice call her name. The father buys ropes, lamps and tools delivered at night. The mother scrubs her skin raw, saying they crawl beneath. The eldest son becomes obsessed with uncovering the history of the land. Servants speak of cold that bites through cotton even in July. These are small facts that when woven together form a thread you must not drop. Note how authority responds in first instance, not with transparency but with private orders and sealed rooms. A physician notes environmental concerns and then is excluded from deeper work. A lieutenant who investigates writes of stale air in a house that seems to swallow sound. When the family unravels outright and the well is open, the narrative splits into 2 paths, one official and tidy claiming excavation and absence, the other a chaos of wounds chanting blood and a descent into a chamber that some men remember and others swear never existed. The tension between the tidy record and the ragged testimony is where power hides its work. If you will follow me, do not come as a tourist, come as an initiated observer. Learn to read the small actions that become instruments of suppression. The sealed ledger, the concrete cap, the sudden cold spot on a map. These are the signs that a story has been judged too dangerous to speak aloud. And when institutions call something a liability, you must ask who benefits from that silence. You must learn to see the house itself as a character. The house prefers low light and few windows on the side of the garden where the well sits. The original French owner built strange drainage in a deep shaft at a time when wells were unnecessary in that geography. The property sells cheap across decades and no one stays long enough to make roots. That pattern matters because scarcity of occupancy is not always coincidence. Sometimes the land repels those who can hear it whisper. Observe how the past speaks through architectural choices and how the practical can be a mask for intent. Early arrivals, the Caldwell family, attempt normalcy and fail because the house has its own memory. Servants recorded in later testimony that meals grew silent, that the family looked at each other as if the same thought had struck them all at once. A shared dread forms faster than any contagion, and it is not by accident. Notice how isolation becomes the incubator of secret work. An experiment needs privacy the way a ritual needs a closed circle. When a merchant buys a secluded lot with a sealed well, he may do so for plausible deniability and for the quiet needed to perform acts that will not survive daylight scrutiny. Small behavioral signs accumulate, and those signs are the real evidence. A child refusing sleep, a daughter kneeling by a sealed well claiming voices, a husband digging in the basement with a fury that makes his business colleagues comment on his absence. These are not random, they point to an escalation and a focus on an access point to the ground beneath. The well is the hinge of the story, and every action around it requires attention. Who sealed the well and why was it previously boarded and disturbed? When workers who later sealed and capped the shaft note that water smelled of old meat instead of earth, that detail is a thread you must pull. Consider the epidemiology of secrecy. The physician who suspects contamination is kept outside the core group. Soldiers and officers who later describe stale air and muffled sound are reluctant to report the full scope. Authorities prefer a closed index and a recommendation to demolish rather than an inquiry that will spread panic, and in that choice you see the first institutional maneuver, containment before truth. A pattern repeated whenever elites fear contagion of perception. Recognize the difference between a public health measure and an act of information control. The latter uses the language of safety to enact forgetting. You are being taught to notice the small instruments of concealment, the heavy slab of concrete used to cap a well, the invoice margin where a worker notes unusual smell, the private letter from the owner referencing Caribbean trade and hints of purpose in the basement. These marginalia are often more honest than the official report. Learn to read the margins as a man trained to see what the book hides. The Caldwell household becomes a theater where ordinary roles fracture and a ritual begins to take form. Servants who once moved like clockwork slow to whispers and separate meals. The eldest sinks into research and obsession. The father alternates between frantic work and trance-like devotion to the cellar. The mother weeps and scrubs her hands until skin raw and calls out of insects under her skin. A boy draws the same circle with rays and calls at the mouth. You must treat these gestures as syntax rather than superstition. They form a language of preparation and feeding. The family becomes both subject and practitioner of a practice with its own rules. Observe how the apparatus of secrecy grows domestic. Tools purchased in secrecy, reading material borrowed from cathedral archives, a leather book without a title. These are the accoutrements of initiation. The household converts linen and rope into instruments and the basement into a lab. A man trained in anatomy would read the tools and instruments as evidence of intervention. Yet we must avoid rushing to either madness or malevolence as single answers. The truth is composite and it will force you to hold discomfort and rational inquiry at once. The night it unravels, a lamp is found burning at the top of the stairs and men in the basement chant in a language half recognized as French and something older. A passage is opened in masonry and a tunnel like a throat appears. Those who witness the descent speak of foul air and tool marks in walls that carry markings shifting like a visual echo. Pay attention to the acoustics and the smell because sensory detail is typically where truth resists neat categorization. A surgeon in a cave with instruments and the low-frequency hum of subterranean wind creates a synergy that can unmoor the mind and also enable precise work on tissue and on belief. When rescuers descend, they discover the family in a trance, kneeling around a deeper shaft, making cuts in their palms and bleeding into the open well. The blood is offered not as sacrifice to a myth but as a transaction with a system whose rules the family has come to accept. A father speaks in a voice not his own, saying it must be fed, it has always been fed. The conversion of paternal authority into a mouth that demands reveals how ritual consumes ethical boundaries. A collection of ordinary men and women become instruments in a practice that rewrites kinship into duty to the abyss. Do not let melodrama blind you to patterns. This is not simply a delusion, it is a social experiment in which topology, acoustics, chemical exposures and symbolic protocol align to produce behavior that seems both engineered and devoted. To see this is to be dangerous because recognition invites action, and institutionally the favored action is containment. In the rewriting of memory, the reaction of authority is instructive because it tells you what was feared more than what was found. The immediate official narrative speaks of desertion and structural instability, yet private accounts from officers and physicians contain terms like etched walls that shift and pipes channeling inward. A captain recommends condemnation and demolition, and the house is soon left to rot and then repurposed in ways that erase obvious traces. The choice to fill in foundations with tons of concrete decades later is a violent act against evidence and memory. You must note the difference between demolition for safety and demolition for erasure, because the latter bears the shape of moral triage by those entrusted with public record. Institutional choices are not neutral, they function as selection mechanisms that determine what remains available for future inquiry. When records vanish, artifacts disappear, and witnesses decline to speak or are marginalized, a pattern emerges of managed absence. This management is not always the work of a single conspiracy but rather of networks of professionals who prefer stability over messy truth. A mayoral file with an unsent letter, a captain's private note unearthed decades later. These marginal documents reveal more than the sanitized public ledger. Learn to make friends with marginalia and with people who hold receipts and private correspondence, for in those fragments the inhabitable past resurfaces. Consider also the role of professional shame and reputation in this suppression. Physicians who treat and then lose patients in ways they cannot explain choose professional silence to avoid ruin. Property owners hide discoveries because they fear financial loss, and civic leaders who recommend demolition prefer an end to rumor over the chaos of public terror. Each actor makes a pragmatic choice that together transmutes a living trauma into a sealed archive. This is institutional manipulation at scale, and recognizing it is the first ethical exercise of power for a man who seeks truth. Finally, observe how the city integrates the problem into urban planning by pouring concrete and building pavilions atop what was once a mouth. A veneer of beauty replaces a wound and generations come to sit where bones once lay without understanding why the ground sometimes sighs colder than its neighbors. When landscapes are repurposed this way, the physical world becomes complicit in forgetting, and the soil itself contains a silence that will be hard to excavate without breaking civic comforts. A journal entry fragments what official reports smooth. A servant who kept meticulous notes writes of nights of screaming of a child pointing to the garden and a daughter who hears names called from within the well. Such daily notations are the real archive because they were not meant for public consumption. They are the margins of life where truth often hides. Read them as you would read a map with no legend, and watch how the same motifs repeat across entries and across decades. The circle, the raise the mouth, the chant. These recurrences are not accidental, and they map a protocol rather than delirium alone. When a trained man performs incision on himself or others under altered perception, you must ask about techniques and controls. Jeremiah-like figures in other histories have used notation and instruments to attempt change. A convergence of anatomical knowledge and symbolic instruction is possible and dangerous. The presence of blades of French manufacture with arranged remains suggests methodical practice and not random carnage. Surgical practice and secrecy produces evidence that looks ritual, and ritual that looks like experiment, and the ambiguity is where institutions prefer to operate. The child's drawings are not childish, they are a notation system simplified into image. The repeated circle with radiating lines approximates a center-seeking pattern, and the boy's phrase "the mouth is hungry" is a vector, a simple declarative that encodes a demand and a purpose. You must learn to treat artifacts of play as potential vectors of ideology because children learn language before they learn rational skepticism, and their drawings can preserve the syntax of what adults hide in lectures and ledgers. Note the physical details and testimonies: the cold that bites in August, the smell like old meat in a well which should carry water odors. These sensory anomalies point to a material cause, perhaps a biochemical agent or fungal compound that alters perception and physiology when concentrated in a closed environment. Yet material explanations must be tested alongside cultural ones, for human ritual practice can amplify physiological effects into coherent shared behavior. The intersection of the material and the symbolic is the locus of engineered transformation, and your job as an initiated observer is to map both vectors simultaneously. Look beyond single cases to patterns. In 1908, workers find arranged bones around a stone structure and catalog blades of a known manufacture. In 1924, a researcher maps cold spots that recur at the garden pavilion. In 1937, a child is found inside a locked pavilion speaking of hungry people below. In 1957, engineers note drainage that seems to funnel inlet toward a center. These incidents across a century form a signature, and signatures repeat for reasons beyond coincidence. Networks propagate symbols and practices, and those who steward property or archives may act to silence discoveries that threaten social equilibrium. When artifacts vanish from museum storage, or when a watchman is found in Catatonia clutching a sketchpad covered in the same glyph, you must ask who controls the archive and why removal is often the preferred solution over debate. The disappearance of critical objects is a form of censorship enacted by bureaucratic hands wearing gloves. Institutions are seldom purely neutral, and when they assert neutrality, they are often exercising power to shape narratives in ways that benefit those who can absorb the cost of forgetting. The glyph itself deserves your attention. It is not merely decoration, it functions as a tool that can alter perception and coordinate action. A hybrid of indigenous geometry and European mathematical syntax, it suggests a designed protocol meant to be read and enacted by someone trained in both symbol and scalpel. Such a system requires apprenticeship and secrecy to transmit, and thus will anchor itself in families and networks that can protect its method through silence and through selective destruction of records. Do not romanticize the past, see it as an ecology of influence where knowledge spreads by teaching tools, texts and rituals, and where those who wish to control the spread will often act with administrative force, whether by sealing a well or by quietly removing a stone cylinder from a crate in a storage room. Your work is to map the actors' networks and mechanisms, and then choose which vector of action you will embody as a witness. The human tendency when faced with the inexplicable is to categorize and to simplify, but simplification is a tool of control. Officials rationalize and physicians dismiss as mania, while artifacts and marginal notes persist. A man trained in inquiry resists easy labels and instead traces causal threads. Begin with the material, the drainage, the stone, the blades, and the cold anomaly. Assemble those facts, then layer in testimony, then examine institutional behavior, and you will find a mesh rather than a single cause. This mesh is where elite knowledge Operates because complexity resists public outrage and is easier to bury than a headline. Remember the social costs for those who ask difficult questions. Professor Whitman in 1963 abandoned his research after describing movement within organic samples and hearing the circular patterns repeat in documents he catalogued. He did not finish because obsession transformed into a threat in his life, and academia is unforgiving to those who destabilize reputations. Daniel Crawford-style disappearances reappear across cases, and you must accept that pursuing forbidden knowledge carries personal risk and social isolation. That knowledge itself will ask for protective measures and alliances if it is to survive beyond whispers. Note also the economy of secrecy. Property owners seal wells to preserve values. Civic leaders recommend demolition to avoid panic, and real estate files show owners selling at loss. Secrecy has a cost, but it is paid quietly by victims and by the culture of forgetfulness. When the market fears a story, it will enforce silence with mortgages and legal threats, and the social apparatus will quietly reorganize space to erase evidence. The plaza over the old well is a marketplace strategy as much as a civic beautification plan. You are being trained to think in layers. Layer 1 is material phenomena and physical evidence. Layer 2 is ritual and symbolic practice. Layer 3 is institutional response and suppression. And Layer 4 is cultural memory and transmission. Your task is to hold all 4 layers at once and to recognize the seams where they stitch together into a practice that can be spread or contained. I will now ask you to adopt a posture of disciplined skepticism paired with moral clarity. Skepticism without courage is cowardice, and courage without skepticism is fanaticism. Those who chased the Caldwell file were undone by leaning too far in one direction or the other. Dr. Beaufort, who descended the passage, documented shifting markings in an architecture that felt both artificial and older than known settlement. His notes read like a physician becoming a chronicler of the impossible, and he paid a price in reputation and perhaps in life. Professionals are vulnerable when institutions prefer tidy narratives, and your role is to refuse the tidy while avoiding the lure of sensationalist certainty. Focus on the instruments found in subterranean chambers. Blades, jars, and tool marks indicate deliberate human intervention rather than natural accumulation. When bodies are arranged in skulls oriented deliberately, a pattern of ritual is present whether the participants understood the full metaphysical claim or treated it as protocol. Ritual can be engineered, and engineered ritual can be weaponized to produce predictable psychological states that then justify further interventions. This is the dangerous fusion of technique and belief you must study. Pay attention to language used by witnesses. The phrase "it must be fed" recurs and functions as an operational imperative rather than metaphoric speech. When a family member repeats a phrase in a voice unfamiliar, that is not merely theatrical, it is instruction internalized and enacted. Such mantras within closed circles become binding and serve to coordinate action under altered states. Training people to obey a phrase is a technique of control as old as oath and newer than modern ethics. Finally, notice how the city absorbs the scandal into civic fabric and then uses urban planning to bury it physically. Concrete poured and pavilions built are architectural silences meant to stabilize markets and memories. You must recognize that geological interventions can be as political as bans on books, and that the built environment is often where power stages its final acts of forgetting. You are now halfway into this descent, and you must mark your commitment to witness and to resist. Erasure. If you are willing to bind yourself to this knowledge, type in the comments shadow oath twice to declare your status as a witness and to signal that you refuse passive forgetting. This act is both ritual and public testimony, and it will align you with others who choose to see rather than to pretend ignorance. The request is not for spectacle but for identification with a lineage of inquiry that understands the cost of curiosity. Consider the moment when artifacts vanish from museums: a stone cylinder removed from secure storage, then a watchman reduced to compulsive replication of the glyph. You must ask who has both motive and capacity to perform such removals. These are not petty criminals but actors with institutional reach and plausible deniability. Museum bureaucracy offers excellent cover because records can be written to obscure chain of custody and receipts can be fraudulent or misfiled. Understand that archive theft at this scale is administrative power masquerading as error. The glyph itself is an interface. It bridges indigenous petroglyphic forms and European mathematical notation, and when synthesized it becomes a protocol designed to model transformation. If you can read it, you would know both the incision schedule and the acoustic conditions to create an effect. The glyph is therefore both map and instrument, and whoever invented it thought like a surgeon and a mathematician, and perhaps like someone who remembered older cultures and could translate their forms. into new technologies of the body. You must also pay attention to how patterns replicate across sites. The Orchard Creek abandonment of 1924, the vanished botanists of 1953, the Mad Trapper incident of the 1890s. These are nodes in a network rather than isolated anomalies. Networks propagate by ritual signs and by controlling access to archives, and when a scholar like Crawford notes repetition, he becomes a threat to the network and to the institutions that protect its continuity. Networks of secrecy survive because they can absorb the loss of a single node and continue functioning across generations. The study of acoustic spaces matters in this case because caves and constructed chambers alter perception and can create the sensation of many voices from a single source. Combine that acoustic phenomenon with low-frequency hums and you approach an environment that shapes cognition. A child with malformed inner ears may be more sensitive to such hums and therefore to messages delivered in frequencies others do not hear. This is why Williams' anatomy matters, because it could explain heightened susceptibility, and why he drew the mouth motif repeatedly as an echo of a perceptual trigger rather than mere fantasy. Look at the tools found deep within a chamber: surgical instruments, jars, and apothecary glass. They denote experimental practice and not crude ritual. When instruments are European and dated to the period, it suggests access to technical supply chains and a mind trained in anatomy. A trained man can weaponize environment and symbol. Placing a book bound in strange material on an altar in an acoustically unusual chamber is a method, not a myth. The book may have been a ledger protocol or notation in cipher, and the impact reported by witnesses of convulsion when it was touched can be explained by acoustics plus psychogenic response amplified across a group primed by ritual gestures. The archaeological reports that catalog tool marks show signs of enlargement of tunnels indicating systematic excavation. Such work requires time, resources, and concealment. Where does that capacity come from for a single family to accomplish such modification? You must entertain institutional patronage or clandestine patron networks that provide labor and resources in exchange for access to the protocol, and that exchange is how occult knowledge becomes an object of elite investment rather than folk memory. This nexus between technical knowledge and resource networks is the heart of forbidden practice. When a method promises transformation, it attracts patrons who want to control outcomes and who can pay for silence. You must follow money and authority to understand how practices survive and are shielded from public scrutiny. The forensic discoveries decades later map material continuity to the initial events. Remains arranged in circles around a central structure and blades of a specific manufacture suggest continuity of practice rather than ad hoc disposal. These bones were not dumped, they were placed and oriented, and that orientation means ritual logic, and that logic requires a script and a practitioner who could coordinate bodies and objects into a pattern that held meaning for participants and for those who would later steward the knowledge. Historians who followed the trail suffered professional marginalization and personal cost. Mitchell and Whitman both encountered obfuscation and institutional inertia, and their experiences reveal how bodies of knowledge are policed by academic and civic authorities when those bodies threaten stable narratives. The story of suppression is as instructive as the original atrocity, for it shows the mechanisms that will be used against any future investigator who threatens to reopen the wound. The missing stone cylinder is a case study in artifact politics. A photograph, a rubbing, and then absence is a typical path for contested objects. When an object is removed from a public catalog, the story it carried is neutered for future scholarship. Every missing artifact multiplies epistemic risk and reduces the possibility of communal reckoning. If you want to disrupt that system, you must build redundancy in memory and in documentation, and you must cultivate repositories that resist institutional pressure to forget. Finally, consider human networks that transmit ritual knowledge. These networks can be family-bound and geographically rooted, but they also migrate into professional circles where training and resource exchange sustain practice. The hybrid glyph suggests cross-cultural synthesis, and that synthesis requires translators, people who can cross boundaries of language and technique, and those people form the backbone of any operational tradition that seeks to persist across generations. You must interrogate motive and method simultaneously. Motive is the hunger to produce transformation, whether spiritual, political, or material. Method is the set of techniques employed to realize that transformation. In the Caldwell case, the motive may be a desire for power over life and death, or for a technology that enables control over perception and obedience. The method combined geography, acoustics, incisions, and symbolic notation to produce predictable altered states in subjects who were often Family and servants. Such internalized obedience is attractive to those who wish to institutionalize control because it creates a stable substrate for further experiments and for social engineering at scale. When institutions decide to extinguish memory, they invoke public safety as the legitimation device and martial legal tools, deeds and demolition to erase traces. This is not merely pragmatic, it is political. It establishes precedents that certain knowledge is too dangerous for public deliberation and that elites have the right to manage collective memory for the sake of order. Once you see this logic, you see identical structures across other scandals where economic interest and civic reputation trump truth and accountability. Pay attention to linguistic patterns in archival marginalia because they often encode truth in ways that formal reports avoid. A mason's marginal note about unusual odor, a captain's private letter expressing inability to explain what was found. These small phrases are often written for future confidence, and they reveal uncertainty and fear where official documents offer certainty and closure. Cultivate an archive practice that privileges these handwritten margins and private correspondences, because they are the vectors most likely to survive deliberate erasure. Finally, when you study burial arrangement and tool presence, treat them as data, not as sensational ornaments. The pattern of skulls oriented toward a center and blades present implies a ritual calculus, and that calculus can be modeled if you have the patience and the methodology to translate symbolic action into formal variables. Transformation practices are often systematized, and when systematized they can be studied and understood, and eventually interrupted symbols matter because they condense practice into a readable interface. The glyph associated with the Caldwell site is not a curiosity, it is a protocol, and protocols can be replicated once decoded. The hybrid nature of the mark combining petroglyphic geometry with mathematical notation is evidence of deliberate design aimed at coordinating multimodal interventions across body and environment. To decode such a glyph requires a mind fluent in both indigenous spatial logic and European formalism, and that rare fluency explains why transmission is limited to tight networks and why secrecy is necessary for survival of the practice. The Watchman reduced to repetitive sketching shows how images can hijack cognition. Some forms produce compulsive replication when viewed, and that replication can be used as a vector for memetic contagion. Imagine a symbol that interacts with acoustic patterns and chemical agents to produce trance, and you begin to understand how a glyph can be more than representation. It can be a causal input in a design system of transformation. When scholars like Dr. Morrow analyze rubbings and detect nested recursion, they are not merely doing formal analysis, they are reading the operation manual of a practice. Recursion implies iteration, and iteration implies a sequence of operations that when performed will produce a predictable change in state. A glyph with nested recursion is therefore a sequence map, and its presence in subterranean chambers indicates that performances were organized according to technical instructions rather than improvisation. Take care not to mythologize the glyph into mystical inevitability. Treat it as a technology subject to analysis and disruption. A protocol can be reverse engineered and then neutralized if you have the right combination of linguistic scholarship, acoustic modeling, and material science. The path from understanding to intervention is technical and requires multidisciplinary practice and moral courage. Follow the educational breadcrumbs because they reveal capacity and intent. A medical student trained in comparative anatomy and interested in physiological malleability will think differently about a cave than a farmer or a priest. Training shapes perception and therefore the design of experiments. The record of a student from Richmond who argued for malleability of form clarifies how anatomical knowledge can be converted into radical experimental practice when oversight is absent and isolation is available. Academic institutions often disclaim responsibility for alumni who practice unorthodox methods, but the intellectual lineage matters because it shows that the practices were not born from madness alone but from contested theoretical positions and ethical failures. A dissertation that speculates about inducing anatomical change through environment and chemicals is dangerous in itself, and when put into practice in a hidden site becomes a social hazard. Follow the training to its end and you find where method arises from theory and where theory becomes practice without the brakes of peer review or oversight. When professional authority is implicated, the responses that follow are different. Institutions seek to preserve legitimacy and will often engage in quiet removal of incriminating objects or documents rather than public reckoning. This administrative suppression is an institutional method of triage, and it must be recognized as such. To hold institutions accountable, you must document procedures of removal and the chain of custody and then publicize them in a way that makes silence costly for the Actors involved. Finally, reframe your approach to evidence by combining archival forensics with material science. A hybrid investigation will reveal whether organic materials moved in response to stimuli, whether acoustic signatures exist that match witness reports, and whether glyph geometries correspond to mathematical transforms. Only a hybrid practice will convert rumor into testable hypothesis, and that conversion is the only path from forbidden knowledge to public responsibility. Obsession is the price of knowledge, and many who chased the Caldwell file paid it. Professor Whitman withdrew from academia after describing movement in organic samples under the pavilion. His notes document patterns and a growing fixation on circles and radiating motifs that appeared in documents and in the soil samples themselves. Obsession can break a man or sharpen him. Recognize which happens to you and prepare accordingly. The investigator must build alliances and redundancy lest a single compromised node extinguish the inquiry. Network analysis reveals repeated events and nodes of recurrence. The 1890s mad trapper, the orphan bones found in 1908, the chilling cold mapped in 1924. These are not stray anomalies but markers of a system that may adapt and survive across decades. When you see a pattern repeated across time, invest in cross-domain collaboration, because patterns are revealed only when historical data is combined with geophysical mapping and linguistic decoding and forensic anthropology. Understand the ecology of secrecy. Patrons who fund risky experimental practice require plausible deniability and prefer artifacts removed rather than exposed. This economy of secrecy is sustained by legal tools and social influence, and it poisons the possibility of open science. To combat this, you must create parallel archives and public coalitions that can make erasure politically costly and socially visible. Transparency is a strategy, not a moral luxury. Finally, accept that forbidden knowledge will always attract those who seek shortcut power, whether for personal transcendence or for political control. The Caldwell case teaches that techniques promising transformation are attractive to both sincere seekers and cynical patrons, and you must cultivate both ethical boundaries and technical literacy if you intend to prevent exploitation of vulnerable people in the name of radical inquiry. The material substratum matters. Laboratories and chambers can be engineered, and the acoustic profile of a cavern can be modeled and manipulated. When low-frequency hums combine with enclosed spaces, people report time dilation, dissociation, and collective vocalizations collapsing into a single chorus. Engineering such effects requires both knowledge and resources, and that implies networks beyond isolated families. Trace the logistics of labor supply, excavation materials, and access to tools, and you will likely reveal patronage or client networks that profit from secrecy. Symbolic systems scale when encoded as notation and instruction. A glyph that maps transformations is only useful if readable by a practitioner and reproducible across sites. This reproducibility requires apprentices in texts, and that is why artifacts like a bound book or written ledger become targets for removal. Institutions that remove texts do so to interrupt transmission and to sever apprenticeship chains. When you find gaps in mentor relationships, you often find intentional disruption of learning pathways meant to prevent replication. Consider the ethics of intervention. Once a practice is decoded, it can be neutralized, but intervention must be surgical and socially aware, because legislation and public revelation can cause panic and harm innocent custodians. Craft strategies that prioritize containment of harm and restoration of truth while minimizing collateral damage. The goal is not spectacle but restoration of agency to victims and to communities whose landscapes were repurposed into instruments of control. Finally, train yourself in humility and resilience. Forbidden archives will test your assumptions and your courage. The world of concealed practices contains both pathological cruelty and earnest human striving, and your role is to separate predation from pursuit and to act with discipline and moral clarity. Researchers vanish or are discredited when they threaten networks that rely on silence. Daniel Crawford, who traced land records from Greene County to New Orleans, found patterns repeated across decades and disappeared soon after, claiming to be followed by men in dark suits. His materials were scattered and a promised dossier vanished. This is the predictable arc of investigative danger, and you must prepare contingencies for data preservation and public release before pursuing high-risk archives. The calculus of risk includes professional exile and personal danger, and the modern investigator must therefore build institutional allies and public coalitions, publish incrementally and create redundancy in physical and digital storage, and cultivate legal support that can intervene when materials are seized or misrepresented. Secrecy thrives where knowledge rests on single custodians and collapses when redundancy is enforced and when journalism couples to scholarship to make removal politically costly. Historical patterns show that networks that manage forbidden knowledge use plausible deniability and administrative errors to achieve removal. When artifacts are moved from museum storage, the paperwork often trails and inconsistencies can be leveraged to create pressure for formal inquiry. Archival sleuths must therefore be as much forensic accountants as philologists and geophysicists. The work spans domains and demands practical competence in many fields at once. In the end, you must accept personal cost as an element of responsibility. Witness requires more than curiosity, it requires stewardship. The Caldwell file will not yield neat closure and some materials will remain inaccessible. Your duty is to preserve what you can and to build public mechanisms that reduce the ability of professional networks to bury truth through administrative power. You have walked from surface to well and back into light, and you are not the same man who began this descent. You have learned the anatomy of erasure, the tactics of institutional manipulation, and the hybrid nature of practices that live between science and ritual. This knowledge is dangerous because it grants you sight, and with sight comes obligation. Do not hoard what you know, use it as a tool to restore record and protect future victims. Be strategic in disclosure and relentless in documentation. If you choose action, begin with modest steps. Digitize marginalia and private letters, create distributed archives with public keys and mirror sets, build coalitions of journalists, historians, and scientists, and mount forensic investigations that combine acoustic modeling, soil analysis, and symbol decoding. Make removal of artifacts visible and demand chain of custody transparency, and adopt legal strategies that make administrative erasure costly and public. Remember the ritual I asked you to perform earlier when we reach the halfway mark. That public act binds you to a lineage of witnesses, and you must honor it by preserving evidence and by mentoring others in disciplined inquiry. Witness without stewardship is a hollow ritual, and stewardship without witness is impotent silence. Combine both and you become part of a living counterforce to institutional forgetting. The Caldwell mystery is more than an event, it is a template. Study it to recognize its echoes in other times and places, and then act to make the arc of history bend toward transparency. When men choose to protect memory rather than property, they change the balance of power and reduce the capacity for future concealment. This is the work of a gentleman with courage and of a scholar with muscle. Take this knowledge and build the structures that ensure the mouth is never fed again.